Right. Hi, everyone. Welcome
Hello.
to everyone online. Please tell us where you're from in the chat box. Nice to see Professor King here as well. Julie, hi, Julie Garland McLellan, who's actually Australia, but she's in Spain at the moment. Dr. Kravatzky, Axel, is in Trinidad and Tobago. Jane is in Saudi Arabia, and Tracy and Erika are in the UK. So if you tell us where you are at the moment in the chat function, see Malaysia, Johannesburg. There were a few that were from down south in Australia, and I did see someone said that they were coming in from New Zealand, which is very late or very early, whichever way you can position that. But welcome everyone. Please, if you have any questions for the panel today, put it in the Q&A box so we can distinguish from the actual chat that's going on. Please chat in the chat box. Tell us where you're from, comment on what's being said, provide your own opinions, and then if you have questions, if you just highlight them in the Q&A box so that we can get to them and answer them. But without any further ado, and I know that Professor Bob Garratt will be joining us later, and unfortunately, David Beattie is not available to join us today. He sends his sincere apologies. But if I can just introduce you to Julie. Julie is a long-term governance expert, works for the AICD in Australia, works with the Governance Institute in Australia, is the author of many books. And of course, Julie is here today because she facilitated our first Governance Summit, which happened last year. And last year's Governance Summit, the video is available on the event page on the Good Governance Academy website. And you can go and have a look. And there we had Professor King, Professor Garratt, as well as Peter Day from Canada. Shortly after that event, it was an hour discussion, we had the launch of ISO 37000, which is the first international benchmark for good governance. It's the ISO standard. Everybody understands the International Standards Organization standard. So this year, we've also got Axel Kravatzky here, Axel is now the vice chair of that technical committee in ISO to give us a little bit of progress on that standard. But let me hand over to Julie and I'll leave the conversation to you. Thank you so much, Julie.
Thank you, Caroline, and welcome everybody. I am working on the assumption that you don't actually want to hear very much from me because we have so many other excellent experts for you to listen to. I'm not going to read the CVs or accreditations. We could spend the whole hour and a half just giving justice to the people we have. So what I propose to do is to remind you that you have on your on the web page and on the registration link the CVs of all of our wonderful experts. And the theme today is about where are we going, where are we headed? And it reminds me of that old saying that if we keep going the way we are, we're going to wind up where we are headed. So I might start by inviting you, Professor King, to share with us some insights from your virtual traveling all around the world last year. What, in your experience, are the key things that indicate the current state of governance around the world? And what are the issues that are keeping real directors awake at night?
There's one word, Julie, and that's survival. The boards of directors around the world have been and still are in survival mode and waiting hopefully for about, I estimate, 2 years' time, and we'll move back into a thriving mode. But with the war in Ukraine, etc., there are many hurdles to get back into that thriving situation. So at the moment, there are demands by the various stakeholders and companies. And the board should, as a matter of proper governance, have learned and understood the needs, interests, and expectations, but now also the hardships suffered by their stakeholder groupings during the pandemic. Likewise, the stakeholders have to realize the company has suffered hardships during the pandemic. So in the various issues which will arise between the stakeholders and the company, you have to have what I have termed a collaborative, integrated, and compromising approach to issues between the company and its various stakeholders to arrive at situations in the best long-term interest of the health of the company. Because we know that SDG 17 is collaboration. And if ever there was a time for collaboration between stakeholders and the company, this is it. And I think what would keep me awake tonight as a director is to make sure that I survive during these critical times of high inflation, expected higher interest rates, and of course the rising cost of fuel, which has a knock-on effect on products in supply chains. So survival would be something which would keep me awake at night. But at the same time, one can't stop planning for the thriving situation when the thriving mode arrives. So you've got to maybe tweak your business model, your strategy, and the purpose of the company must be relooked at. And by purpose, I mean a profitable solution without adverse impacts on people and planet, if possible. And if there are adverse impacts, what are your plans to eradicate or ameliorate those? So these are the things which I think are keeping boards awake at night at the present time. Thank you, Julie.
Thank you. Very insightful, very important. Now, Tracy, I might invite you to comment next. You've been really busy analysing annual reports of UK companies and specifically focusing on the way in which they report on their governance. Your report isn't yet released, but it is due for release soon. Are there any insights that you can provide and share with us today?
Yes, thank you, Julie. And yeah, we are hoping that it's our annual survey of corporate reporting insights, so very much looking across, and it is based on UK reporting, but hopefully that's not a bad place to focus, because I think what we're trying to see, and it very much tallies in with what Professor King was saying, boards very much are trying to focus now on survival, absolutely, as was said. And I think what we're seeing is that during that kind of survival response, that having a really strong core purpose is very key to that and helps keep the organization in its response to particular challenges and crises, that having a really strong purpose can help with maintaining the core direction of an organization. And it's that purpose that we have been focusing on quite a bit in our reviews of the disclosures that we're seeing in the UK. And really, I think it's clear for us that things have definitely moved on. Now, I think virtually all the companies that we looked at, and we looked at a good sample across the whole listed spectrum. We didn't just focus on the very largest. We tried to look at a very diverse population of listed companies. But they are really trying to now articulate a clear purpose. And I think that this is clearly something that has evolved. In the starting point, some were getting confused with, was purpose more of a marketing slogan? What difference was it between a mission statement and a vision statement? But I think there is more clarity now around statement of purpose. But what we now want to see as a next step of evolution of these disclosures is really not just having a nice statement up front and then it's not referred to anymore in the rest of the reporting, and so that you really don't get the flavor that the board is actually using that purpose statement. In the better reporters now, what we're really seeing is that they are joining all the dots up, they're aligning everything, they're making sure that you have clarity from a clear statement of purpose, followed by a clear statement of what the values of the business are, and that there is a clear then connection and alignment through to the strategy of the business, the culture of the business, and the way the board is exercising its oversight over that. So that's really what we've been looking at, and hopefully in our survey, when it's issued, you'll be able to see some good practice examples of companies that have done that really well, really articulated a clear purpose statement, and then shown how that drives then the strategy and the culture. And, you know, as has been mentioned, how that purpose has helped a board to respond and reflect on challenges that have been arising over the last few years, so that they have been able to adapt their strategy, and they've been able to make sure that there's a good alignment continuing throughout, and that it's possible for the board, because this is another area that we're really seeing, is to provide good disclosure. It's really important to step away from reams and reams about process and really focus on impact and real life examples of decisions that were taken in response to particular challenges from stakeholders, you know, the feedback, the collaboration that Professor King mentioned. If boards are gathering a lot of information now from engagement with their stakeholders, what you need to reflect in your reporting is, well, what did you do as a result of that? And that's, you know, we're trying to draw out good practice examples from that in our survey work.
Excellent. Thank you, Tracy. And yeah, it's so important when we think about governance that what we say is not just what the regulators have asked us to say, but what's going to have meaning and what is going to help our stakeholders to understand why we are doing what we do and what is the impact of the things we do. Jane, I might invite you to join the conversation next and just take us through, how do some of the insights that we've heard from Professor King and from Tracy, or from Mervyn and Tracy, how do those insights resonate with your experience, and particularly with the work of the Gulf Cooperation Council, or the GCC countries in the Middle Eastern region? What are the differences? What are the similarities?
Thank you very much. And it's interesting to hear the different insights from different parts of the world. And of course, you know, the Middle East, but particularly the Gulf, is in a different phase. It's in a very interesting phase at the moment, but I would call it a phase of transition, where it is joining the global economies of the world. The desire to move from becoming emerging economies to becoming, you know, developed economies. And they've clearly understood that in order to do that, they have to play by the global rules in general. And what we've seen really is I think the regulators coming from way behind the curve in the last 5 or 6 years, really since 2016, a huge change in the regulatory frameworks in our part of the world. New company laws, not just once, but twice, you know, as the company regulations are updated and improved. New codes of corporate governance in all the countries in the Gulf, and with Saudi Arabia leading the way, actually, which is good because it's the largest economy in the region. And all led by their country visions, really. Saudi Arabia Vision 2030 is the one that we all look to, where they're looking towards becoming, you know, changing the engine of the train from being an oil economy to a non-oil economy, whereby, you know, 80% of the revenues come from oil at the moment, and where by 2030, they want 80% of the revenues in the economy to come from non-oil. And they see, therefore, the private sector being the engine for that growth, pushed heavily, of course, by the government sector. And I think what we're seeing, therefore, is a huge adoption with strong regulators for corporate governance. Also a huge push towards companies becoming listed on the stock exchange. I was talking to the head of the Capital Market Authority in Saudi Arabia last week. They have had 25 new listings since January this year. I think that might even be a world record. It's certainly a record for Saudi Arabia. And they've got another 75 in the pipeline this year alone. and the regulators saying, you know, perhaps we ought to slow down. And I said, you must be the only stock exchange in the world that's actually saying that, because that's not happening anywhere else to my knowledge. So there is this huge, what I would call transition, not only towards a non-oil economy, but, you know, the whole challenges of the digital world and the IT economies that we have, and the new opportunities that that brings with it. And therefore, I think a recognition of the importance of corporate governance and obviously the application of it, because it's not just the awareness. Now they have to understand how to apply it. So there's been a huge progress in this part of the world, but there's still a lot more to do. And I think that what we saw in our last survey, we do a biannual board effectiveness survey, and the last one was 2021. I think that what we saw as the key indicators was a huge pressure on companies to change. There's a large number of family businesses in this part of the world, bigger and wealthier than a lot of other places in the world, and they're huge risk as we move from the second to the third generation. And therefore, we see codes of corporate governance for non-listed companies. While they're not mandatory, there's pressure to adopt. And I think that we are seeing also pressure on boards to diversify, to encourage truly independent directors, more women on boards, although that's clearly a challenge in this part of the world because they didn't have a pipeline. But also, you know, some concerns about the availability of talent for the board. So that there's a lot that has happened. There's a lot more to do, I would say. And therefore, yes, you know, obviously, if you look at a mature market like the UK, talking about purpose, we're still some way away from that. We're still getting the basics of good corporate governance in place, and the understanding that, you know, the rest of the world is still overtaking us when it comes to talk about sustainability or ESG. But it is beginning to get onto the board agenda in the region.
It's an interesting transition, isn't it, that we're going through, with people starting to recognize that actually governance isn't just a nice to have, it's something that adds value, that has a return on investment, and that can indeed contribute. So thank you, Jane. Axel, welcome back. It's been a very interesting year for you. We've had the launch last year of the International Standard for Governance. Has there been a massive transition? Are people taking it up? Is it having an impact? How's it all working out? What insights do you have?
Okay, thank you, Julie. Yes, so last year, ISO launched 3 corporate governance related standards, 37,000, which is governance of organizations guidance. So that is the main foundational standard. But in addition to that, there is also 37,001, which is anti-bribery, 37,002, which is whistleblowing, and 37,301, which is about compliance management systems. And I think the theme that is in the air right now is all about integration. And it has to do with the survival part that Professor King was speaking about, and also survival at the company level as well as at the collective and global level. As the Secretary General of the UN just reminded us this week, as to there is no shortage of urgency. And the solution in some ways is around the integration, both integration of the what and the who. So in terms of delivering on the purpose, which is about well-being of people and the planet, and doing that in a way that doesn't damage the basis, the capitals upon which we are building and from which we are deriving the value in an efficient way. And that involves all parts that are involved in governance. So integrating all the right parties to work together within and for organizations to generate that value. And that is the core theme in 37,000, which introduced integrated governance as a term. and is a theme throughout ISO, where basically all the work is seeking to make lives easier, safer, and better, and working very hard and dedicated to ensure that they are aligned and supporting the transition towards sustainable development. So if 164 countries balloted and approved 37,000 last year unanimously, and the key is really about the engagement of the stakeholders, because the way it works also for the adoption afterwards is that there are direct users, so there are individual companies or institutions that may adopt or integrate the standard for their own use. And then there are also at the national level. So what happens is that at the moment, a number of countries in no particular orders, like Argentina, Peru, Switzerland, Nigeria, Romania, South Africa, Sweden, Cote d'Ivoire, in the Caribbean, and Trinidad, St. Lucia, Jamaica, a number of many countries are either have adopted already or will be adopting it soon. But the process is important, because what happens is that the national standard setting bodies need to conduct national consultations. And on the basis of those consultations, they may make further amendments, national deviations to the standard, or adopt it as is. But the process in ISO of building strong consensus across stakeholders in an inclusive way, I think is the signature part that is very necessary in order for us to be able to create that integration, and hopefully also the acceleration of at an individual company level in terms of the transformation and the resilience that is currently necessary for it, but also at the collective level, which may be, for example, also to capital markets, which are undergoing bigger transformations themselves, and which are also very necessary in order to create the engagement and the funding of this transformation that we so desperately need individually and collectively. So that is the main theme right now, and what is happening. And I hope that provides an overview, Julie.
I think it provides a wonderful overview. And we've all sort of moved around Mervyn's comments about survival into planning for thriving, and into those comments around transparency, equity, ESG. There's some comments in the chat about whether or not, in fact, the transparency and the ESG is really a growing movement, or whether the wave has crested and it's now starting to move back, and there might even be a blowback. And I have heard a few people saying that really the board should be focusing on prosperity and on inclusion in economic prosperity. I'd like to encourage any brave panelist for their thoughts on how do we handle these two very important pressures that company decision makers are facing at the moment.
Yes, Mervyn.
I saw Mervyn's hand go up first, and then we'll ask you, Jane.
I think,
Sure.
Sorry, Jane, I think the answer to that is very clear. That going back many years ago to the formation of the International Integrated Reporting Council, when we had our first meeting, and I remember it well, because it was trying to herd cats into a room at the time, because we had leading regulators and companies in the room. And one thing was clear, because John Elkington was there, and John had spoken about the triple bottom line and reporting as a triple bottom line. Well, no one ever did. And John and I had this discussion, and he agreed later on that, in fact, a company operates in the triple context of the economy, society, and the environment. So to think, as you postulated, the person who is a director thinks today, I would, with respect, say to that director that he's failing to discharge his duty of care to this incapacitated person, of which he is the heart, mind, soul, and conscience, because the company itself is artificial and doesn't have those qualities. And he cannot ignore that the company is operating in this triple context, and the triple context has an impact on the company, and what the company does has an impact on those three critical factors for sustainable development. Hence, we've had this development over the last couple of years of inside-out sustainability. So how does the company make its product? And what are the impacts on those three critical dimensions for sustainable development, the economy, society, and the environment? And then we've had this extraordinary collapse of Lehman Brothers, which showed that these three critical factors are having an impact on the company, outside in. So it had an impact on the company's financial condition, its balance sheet. It had an impact on the company's operating performance, its income statement, its cash flow. And it had an impact on the company's risk profile, its cost of capital. So any director who ignores this triple context is in fact failing in his duty of care to the company. And let me just conclude that saying that I happen to be a King's Counsel or Senior Counsel, as known in Australia, and many of my colleagues in Australia have written opinions now to say exactly that a director who fails to do that fails in his duty of care to the company and could be liable in damages to the company.
It's a very sobering thought, isn't it? That liability. Jane, your comments.
Well, I mean, I can only agree with Mervyn, but I think that I think this is just a temporary backlash. I think it's due to some underperforming ESG funds or sustainability funds, investment funds potentially, which I think is completely the wrong way to look at it. I don't think there's any turning back, and this is not a fad. This is here to stay and to grow. And it is absolutely imperative that we all get to grips with it. As I said, we're way behind the curve for many reasons that are obvious in this part of the world, but there is the realization that there is a lot of catching up to do, and they can to some extent leapfrog into the future. I know that when COP26 was on and the UAE and KSA announced their net zero targets, first time ever, most of the large companies in this region got a call from up above saying, where's your plan? We want it by next month. Okay, slightly unrealistic, but the point is they are looking to the private sector to lead this and to lead the charge, and they are serious about it. The next COP is going to be in Egypt and the one after that in the UAE. So we're going to have two COPs right on our doorstep leading this debate and shining the focus on the region, which I think is a great thing.
I think it is. And it is so important to have those holistic plans and not have a plan for this and a plan for that and a plan for the other bottom line as well. Do you think perhaps that we have too much emphasis at the moment on the financial or economic lines and the environmental line and not enough on that third social line? When we look at the immense poverty of some of the nations in Africa, a few of the countries in the Middle East that are really suffering economically, and therefore the people are suffering. When you look at what's going on with Ukraine and Russia, you look at China, which is an immense economy, but one that is bursting at the seams in some respects in terms of the way in which it serves its people. What are your views on that? Perhaps I might invite Erika and Axel to say something.
Yeah. Okay. So I think the the key is about the integration part, right? So, and the integration is to really take into account all the dimensions that the organizations are depending on and the impact it has on them financially, for example. And also in terms of the impact that the organization has on the context in which they're operating. And working with that explicitly and also being accountable for the impacts that they're generating. Now, I think that in the successful organizations that are able to transform their business models from ones that are primarily inward oriented and focused to ones that are integrated and are able to work with the impact that they're generating as well. It is a win-win, as it were, because you are more effective in generating useful outcomes, which will generate more returns and will create greater resilience in the face of uncertainties. But it is a big transition that not many organizations are able to embark on yet. And sometimes when you're under stress, you feel like you need to go back into sort of your corner and just focus on the most immediate things. But building a strong foundation, and if I make a plug again, then for 37,000 and other guidance that is integrated like that, I think is very useful and necessary, but not easy to do. So it is easy conceptually to say that you need to take these dimensions into account. The next question is, okay, and practically, how do you do it? In the sense that you're really dealing with real sustainability topics that are contextual, so that you can say, is this sustainable within this context, as opposed to just a numerator of counting something. So I think this is the current edge at which we are working, and where the gap between those who are doing well, these dimensions well, and those who are laggards is really widening. But the danger is, and I would say the call should be to integrate there as well. So to seek that conversation and the dialogue between these different groups, because splitting is not going to be useful, and we need more integration in order to accelerate collectively.
Definitely, integration does seem to be the key, and the bringing together of those three bottom lines. Erika, any final comments, or should we move on?
Yeah, just a couple of things. I think I would say that it depends on the organization that you're talking about as to how different factors play out. It depends on the stakeholders, it depends on the purpose, back to what Tracy was saying, and it depends on the evolution and development of the business, so how far it is along on its journey, because there will be various different times where it has the opportunity to do things, and obviously it should take those. But there will be times when perhaps it isn't right, back to, I suppose, Mervyn's point, that if businesses are just in the survival mode, then some of these things could be seen as quite blue sky thinking at the moment. That's not to say we shouldn't be considering them and doing them, and perhaps they will fit in with the purpose and perhaps drive value. But it's definitely something to consider in the context of the organization.
It is. And I think that moves us. We were hoping that Professor Garratt would be able to join us before we moved on to the second area of focus, but he's having some technical difficulties this afternoon or this morning, wherever you happen to be in the world, maybe even late this evening. So I might move on then. We've talked about what's going on and what's happening and what are the concerns and what are some of the areas, but let's start having that focus on the future that we're trying to create and really consider what are the areas of governance and what sort of governing should be focused upon over the next year and maybe the next 5 to 10 years. And Erika, I might ask you, because you come to us as the leader of a practitioner organization, and so you have that practical perspective. How do you find the organizations you're engaging with are considering this? Are they still ticking boxes? What do you think they should be focusing on to improve their governance? And what do you think the impact of improved governance is actually going to be?
Thank you, Julie. So I think generally, looking at organizations and box ticking, it still goes on. I think it's potentially to do with a lack of interest in the area, maybe, but sometimes it's just due to being an unknown. They don't understand the value of good governance, and therefore they haven't been educated in that area. Therefore, they wouldn't even think that it was something that they should focus on. In my organization, we're fortunate that the people that do come to us, kind of polarized people, they do tend to be people that don't want to be ticking the boxes, and they want to be doing things that actually work. And as a result of that, we put things in that actually work for their culture and their organization. It's quite bespoke and unique. If we were looking at areas of focus to improve governance practices, the thing that I see most is probably governance frameworks as a whole. So looking at things top to bottom and kind of working out what is working well and where the issues are. And that stepping back goes back to what Mervyn King was actually saying about pain points. So from my perspective, all governance issues come from a pain point, and those pain points need to be identified with whoever it is that you're talking to. And those pain points will then lead to a governance issue. There'll be something that's keeping them up at night, be that sustainability of the business. Well, where's the support network? What exactly are you looking for or hoping to achieve? And why do you feel that that might not be possible? Why is this keeping you up at night? And within the UK, I would say that there are probably 3 areas. One of them we've actually covered already, that is kind of louder noise, I would say, in the governance area. One of them is increased stakeholder accountability. So the expectations from stakeholders are that, for instance, ESG is something that should be an essential part of corporate culture. There's a lot around greenwashing, brownwashing, and platitudes around the DEI kind of policies and culture that kind of happens. And stakeholder activism is on the uptick, and organisations are being called out for that. Within the UK market as well, we've also, another pain point, are changes to the labour market. So as with a number of different countries, we're doing a lot of working from home, and it's the governance that enables those organisations to still function, to retain the right culture, the right behaviours, and actually to get things done when nobody's looking. And this time nobody is actually looking. And so that's something that again comes back to kind of questions that we're being asked. How do you maintain accountability when we can't see anybody? How do we maintain the right culture and behaviours when it's more difficult to be able to get everybody together? And that kind of corporate culture piece, I think, fits perfectly with governance. It's not one that necessarily everybody appreciates, fits together, but it absolutely does, because it drives behaviours. And the other area within the UK is kind of the economic down we are seeing, which is obviously a global issue. So boards need to be more focused on what it is that they need to be looking at. They may well be looking at headcount. They may well be looking at restructuring, and it's the impact that has on the business as well as how they do that effectively. So they're kind of the areas that I would say would be the focus areas for the organisations I've seen. As for what the benefits are of doing that, then, as I've kind of said, culture is interlinked with governance, in my personal view, and therefore being able to have a fantastic culture enables you to achieve more. Your people are more strategic, tactical, they are driven in the right direction. If you wanted to look for investment during tricky times, organisations and fund houses, VCs, PEs are going to look at you in a more preferable light. They're going to say, okay, well, we understand that these guys are going to look after our money. They're doing things right. They've got the right processes and procedures in place. But more importantly, the culture that's in the organisation just makes it feel like this is a really good idea. And that kind of growth. So as much as we may be in a downturn, there's obviously the upside. Not everybody is in a demise. There will obviously be organisations and areas that are growing and also preparing for that growth. And that governance culture and foundations is absolutely important to be able to get that fixed now, so that they can be ready for that acceleration that no doubt will happen.
The very important points that you've raised there. You're getting a lot of feedback in the chat about culture and the importance and the insights that you've just delivered. Axel, how is ISO taking these concepts into consideration? What new standards are you developing to help the governance functions and indeed the overall functioning of the organizations to improve and be able to deliver in a world where these are the important topics that our stakeholders are interested in? What insights do you have from that?
Yeah. Well, I can organize that around the three main outcomes of good governance, which are performance, organizational performance, ethical behavior by the organization, and responsible stewardship. Because all three dimensions are parts that are absolutely critical to our times. And the practical work that is currently going on is in those three dimensions. I may also maybe sort of to locate the work, I think it is useful to think as a mental model, sort of we have the governance topics are being influenced by at market levels or economy level. And there's important work happening there, for example, with the OECD, with the new reporting standards and all that. Those are very important factors that are shaping what is actually going on in organizations and across organizations. Then there's the organizational level itself, where the governing bodies and all involved in governance needs to decide how best to govern and improve their practice. And then there is at the individual level and at the board level or the different governing groups, the individual level, how they make decisions and how they work together and the collective part. So I think the ISO at the moment, I think is from a governance perspective in TC 309 is mostly focused on that second level, which is the organizational level. And its work then influences that which is happening at the market collective level, as well as at the individual level or body level. And within that, I think the main theme right now has to do with this integration bit. So there's an integration both in terms of the systems, so making governance agreeing and in establishing international consensus about what are the dimensions of useful governance frameworks and systems for how they work practically across industries, across countries, and across types of organizations, which is very important because there seems to be a lot of guidance available in some domains, but not in others, and in some countries, but not in others. And using one from one place for another place is not necessarily the best. And also the content-wise, many times they are not focused in this integrative kind of way that is taking into consideration both the consequences as well as the resources of the actions. Practically speaking, I think right now also there are about 4 new standards under development. One that deals with, for example, governance maturity models. So that Erika, for example, spoke about different levels of maturity in organizations. And Carolyn has been leading work on ISO 37004, which is basically helping organizations to evaluate and measure their organizational maturity against the commonly defined maturity model. So it helps practically in that way. Then there are 2 other standards that have to do with decision-making in and by governing bodies and others involved in governance. And one has to do with creating and selecting indicators. So data, consequences, measurement, progress are all very important themes that we have, even about culture and all these different dimensions that we mentioned. So if we are seeking to govern that well and set good expectations and measure progress, we need to use practical, useful, and correct indicators for that. So ISO 37005 is defining that, so that there's a clear common terminology and a logic for how things work together and guidance for how governing bodies can create new indicators if there are none readily available. And the second one, 37,006, deals with indicators of effective organizational governance. So, for example, when we do board evaluations, and you come to the question about, and how well do you think you manage your own performance? Many boards are stumped because, like, how do I start? Where, what do you mean? How do I manage governance performance? Like, well, how do I measure that? So, now, there are a number of indicators used by developed by a number of different organizations. But when you look at it closely, they are not really comprehensive, and they are not really that cohesive and systematic. So here is then a list of indicators that you can then use to say, okay, these are indicators that I can use practically for decision-making in relation to the decision-making of the organization. So governing bodies that seek to improve the functioning of the organization to the highest possible level, what indicators would they use to do that? So that is what this standard is seeking to develop, which I'm involved in leading. And then there is 37,007, which is about efficiency measurement, and so guidance for companies to be able to assess their performance and the relative degree of achievement according to plans. So there are, so everything is going in the direction of practical enabling. How do we give the resources and the common terminology for governing bodies and all involved in governance to raise their performance, to accelerate in a way that is also assurable in the end. So there's a lot of demand for assurance, and many of these standards are guidance standards, which means that they're not certifiable, but they may become in the future once they're being tested and worked on and so forth. But overall, I would say that one of the big trends is that we are in such an interdependent state where informal promises and general intentions are not really good enough, where we really need to know that we're making progress at a sufficient rate. And so that is where the focus is and where our work is heading to.
Thank you, Axel. That's a very complete answer. And an excellent launching. No, that was a very appreciative statement. But it's a perfect launching place. Perhaps, Tracy, if I ask you, we've moved into that whole, how do we measure and how do we standardize? And your understanding from the companies that you've been assessing, do you think boards have these measures within their grasp? Do you think the tools and approaches that are now available can help them to realize the benefits and help them to explain and prove that they've realized the benefits? How's that all going to work?
Yeah, no, it's a really good point, and I very much agree with what Axel was saying, that companies and boards really do need to enable, to be able to demonstrate that they're really taking action on the right areas across the whole ESG spectrum. They do need to be able to have good quality data and information to help them track their performance. And I think if we come back to the question that was earlier around, is there a bit of a backlash against considerations of ESG and sustainability? I think some of that has been driven by a perception that lots of companies are making quite bold statements and commitments, but then as was alluded to, there's then very little evidence of performance in relation to achieving those commitments or objectives. And this is where I think that there is a big step to be played in developing these frameworks that can help companies navigate all of this, to produce good, robust information that stakeholders are then able to rely on with both a bit more confidence, to help them really understand the decisions a board is making and on the basis on which they are making those decisions, so that that they can have that confidence that all the different impacts and relevant considerations from stakeholders are being taken into account. And I agree. I do think there's so much potential for different types of information to be presented, and I do agree that assurance over that information needs to be clear. That's another area. We've got greenwashing, brownwashing, but you can also get assurance washing. You can see references in annual reports to we got assurance on this, but it's really not quite clear what the nature of that assurance was, exactly to what level was the assurance provided, by whom was it provided. Sometimes that there's obviously misconceptions around, with the financial statements in a statutory audit versus then in the more non-financial information. I think there's a real lack of understanding of assurance over that information. And I think that's potentially something that more transparency could help avoid that type of issue, where people are unclear as to exactly the robustness of the data that is being provided, to help them understand the basis of all these board decisions.
Yes, very, very important. And I'm assuming that everybody would agree that greenwashing and brownwashing are just another sort of fraud. They might not be financial, but they're still fraudulent. And with assurance, you very often get exactly what you ask for. So if you don't know what they asked for, you can't really place much value on the assurance that you're given. And of course, different legal contexts and jurisdictions make this all really even more complicated. Jane, I might throw to you, because the governance of some of the organizations in the GCC countries is founded in a really different legal context, equally strong when well applied, but very fundamentally different in how it is conceived and how it works. How are the boards of those companies pivoting to face those same new global challenges that we outlined at the beginning of this session? And how applicable are some of these standards to those organizations in their jurisdictions?
Well, I don't think the legal standards here are so different, especially with the new company laws that have now been updated. Saudi has just brought out its second new company law, as I said, in about 6 years, and in order to meet international standards. So I don't think that the legal frameworks are that different. The societies here have traditionally been very much rules-based societies. They want to be told what to do, and then they'll more or less do it, some willingly, some not so willingly, if you like. But so their struggle is to move towards this notion of understanding the fundamental principles of corporate governance or sustainability and how they can apply it in a meaningful way. So that's the journey that they're on. And they, like any other part of the world, I think they're facing the same struggles. But if you're coming into this fairly recently, as they are, into this world, then it can be a very confusing world out there. And when we've just recently done some research on how companies are adopting ESG in the Gulf, and what we've basically found is that they are talking about it, they are adopting, but they're not necessarily publishing their figures or their reports, because perhaps the figures don't look very good or the reports aren't what they would like to publish, and they're waiting until those reports look better for them to be able to publish. But they are talking about it. It is on the agenda. And I think what they are struggling with is which framework to use. Where are the international standards? And not every country has got, guidelines. In the UAE, they've basically adopted GRI as a fundamental framework. And I think in Saudi too, and the Saudi Stock Exchange now has sustainability guidelines for listed companies. But I think companies are still struggling with how to integrate this into their strategy, into their long-term thinking. And there is a big shortage of sustainability talent or experts in this part of the world to help them. and within their own organizations, there is a big talent gap in many organizations where, you know, capacity building is still, you know, struggling to keep up with the demand. So I think these are the areas that boards are really struggling with here. And, you know, the professional and just really increasing the awareness of the board directors themselves in terms of what these issues really mean for their organizations is huge. We're running a conference on the 6th of October on the whole topic of sustainable development and investment. And you've got some major, huge, I mean, they're calling them mega projects in Saudi Arabia, where they are integrating sustainability into the very concept from the beginning. So that's what I meant by it's almost easier to start from scratch, isn't it? And leapfrog into the future. But they are looking to set themselves new standards of sustainable development in some of these projects, which I think is really interesting. So you've got the whole spectrum here, from companies who haven't started and are struggling where to start, to companies that are sort of literally leapfrogging into the future, and everything in between.
Yes, and it is very interesting. I think you'll find that everywhere we have that range of companies at different stages of their journey. But very good, sitting here in Spain, as I am at the moment, where we have a code-based jurisdiction based on Roman law, which is rather more similar to yours than the principles-based and practice-based systems that you find in particularly the UK and some of the other countries. Very interesting, developing governance that suits both the uniqueness of the organization and the specific demands of the regulatory environment it's in. Erika, I might throw to you from your perspective as a governance practitioner. How do you think boards can best apply all of this guidance in practice? And is there any hope that they'll be able to reliably demonstrate and report positive impacts in the next year or so?
Thank you, Julie. Yes, I do think that there is a possibility, if they so choose, to report something that is tangible and is accurate, non-fraudulent, and actually boosts their business. With regards to applying things practically, the approach that I always take is to understand the organization first and understand where you need to get to. It's pretty much like designing the strategy for the business. Designing the governance and the governance structures that work need to work with where you're trying to get to. And those pain points, as I said earlier, for those senior individuals, the board, etc., will be a really good starting point, because if those things are keeping those guys up, then they should probably be a kind of initial focus to be able to get that resolved. And when those particular areas are resolved, then other areas will obviously come to the fore. And it's kind of going along that process to be able to move things along. Within the UK, we don't have mandated corporate governance, even for the listed organisations. But I do think that many of them are doing a very good job of demonstrating their kind of applicability to the various different governance codes. And many of them are, I suppose, strong enough to say, actually, we're going to explain why we're not doing this rather than comply. And I think that that's a positive output, I think, of the fact that it's not mandated within the UK. And I think those organisations that are able to and happy to stand up and say, actually, we don't comply with this because ... I think actually those organisations are doing a much better job of avoiding kind of almost like governance greenwashing equivalent, because they're happy to stand by and be able to demonstrate and have to have some robust decision making behind that. It's very easy to just get a standard and just apply and say, oh yes, we have a different CEO to we do chair, that's fine, box ticked, that's fine. But if they are intertwined in other ways, then they could still be the same conflict of interest as having potentially the same person. So that's I suppose where I would say to start. Look at the organization, look at the pain points, look at what you have to comply with as far as the governance code that's in your particular jurisdiction, and then from there look at where where the quick wins are, where the things are that will just make a significant difference and kind of move forward, because your board are going to be particularly happy when some of these things are resolved, because they'll be able to focus their attentions on other things, other more important things than the governance, which should be like a swan on water. So the legs are going really crazy underneath, but nobody sees it on top. That's a good governance framework.
Yes, Axel.
Yeah, I have. It strikes me that we have two main tracks that are currently in operation. So at the one hand, there is a collective track where our main challenge is to align the interest and what organizations are doing with the collective interest. And if we don't align that, then we constantly have to try and correct it. And that is almost a task you can't win, sort of through regulation only. So I think and that requires us to have shared understanding, shared norms, shared expectations, shared regulations, and all that. So that is one area which is progressing, I think, where there needs to be more alignment and all that, but okay. The second area has to do with also with what Erika was speaking about and what you mentioned earlier, Julie, as well. And that is maybe at the individual organizational level. And I think what I'm experiencing is that there's a difficulty for a lot of organizations who understand the opportunity and would like to be more aligned, but they face a difficulty in that the immediate context in which they're operating is not really conducive to that. And so basically they have to make decisions. What decisions do we take today for us to be relevant tomorrow, but are able to survive today? And I think that is like, like in traditional management theories. And so, you have this S-curve of organizations as they develop, where, you find a way, then that sort of it plateaus, and then you need to jump onto a new S-curve. The question is, when do you jump? And are you building your new S-curve? And so I think a lot what governing bodies have to do is think fundamentally about the value that they're generating. So, for example, building an integrated value generation model about what constitutes value in this organization. And what are the parameters within which that needs to happen? What is the risk appetite that we can work with? So those are the fundamental questions that are longer term and that allow for medium-term adjustments and also short-term execution. But unless that is being formulated, it's really more knee-jerk reactions and doesn't lead to sustainability of the firm or the collective. So I would say that that is one of the key topics to focus on. And you wouldn't be surprised if you knew that 37,000 has guidance for how to develop an integrated value generation model. But that is, I think, the direction.
I think that is a great direction. Mark Twain once said that making predictions is difficult, and especially so when it's about the future. But given that we've got some great minds here, I might throw to you, Mervyn. Let's round out this panel discussion with your ideas and your predictions. What do you think we'll be talking about this time next year? What do you see coming over the horizon at us?
Well, I think the critical issue is going to be around sustainability reporting. If you look at the international bodies at the moment, the IFRS, the EU, SEC, China, they're very focused on trying to get a standard of sustainability reporting. And I think we should all be delighted that a couple of weeks ago, the Technical Readiness Working Group of the IFRS, EFRAG of the EU, signed an MOU to try and align the double materiality standards developed by the EU, that's inside out and outside in, with the enterprise value creation standards of SASB consolidated into the ISSB, the new sibling to the IASB. And I've argued with the powers that be that if there's not an alignment, you're going to have difficulties in assurance. And also there's going to be language problems. So I'm delighted that an MOU has now been signed by these bodies to try and align the standards disclosed by the EU and the ISSB standards, which will be a la SASB standards. So I think this time next year, we will be more aware, if not absolutely know, what are the standards of sustainability reporting. And I also believe that most countries have, as you know, mandated financial reporting and have mandated either following the IASB standards or the FASB standards. There, of course, are other standards, but those are the two main ones on planet Earth. And I think this time next year, we were talking about how the regulators in Australia, for example, which is my second home, so I know Australia well, has mandated their sustainability reporting. And what's it going to follow? Is it going to be more inclined towards double materiality or more inclined to this enterprise value creation with this concept of interoperability? And then comes the question of assurance. And only this morning I was on the line to people from the IAASB, the International Assurance Auditing and Assurance Standards Board. And they agree with me, external auditor Quo Vadis. If you have a makeup of a company, the market value of a company, 80% is so-called non-financial or ESG issues. And the registered auditor is only auditing 20% of value. Well, what is the future of the profession? And it's absolutely critical to the user that these things are audited, are assured. And it's absolutely critical to the assurance profession that they are able to assure not only the financial reports, but also the sustainability reports. So by this time next year, we will be talking about what kind of standards may be already coming out for the assurance on sustainability reports. And the question of value of a company will be tested. As we see in the capital markets of the world, the asset owners and asset managers do due diligence, not only financial, but do an ESG due diligence. And they don't use the tool of ticking boxes. Yes, you've got a nominations committee, you've got an audit committee, you've got, therefore, you're practicing good governance. They look at the outcomes of your governance. Do you actually have a business model where you're creating value in a sustainable manner? Is there trust and confidence by the community in the company where you operate with legitimacy of operations? Is your leadership effective? Do they know and understand the heart, mind, soul, and conscience of the company? And then when something goes wrong, the wrath of society should, by definition, not turn against this incapacitated person, but against its corporate leaders. And so these are the tests being applied now by asset owners and asset managers in the capital markets of the world. So a huge amount of pressure on companies to start adopting proper sustainability issues and reporting. And it will be necessary to believe that they have been discharged the duty of accountability to the company.
Yes, I think that would be an excellent indicator of progress if that is indeed our topic next year. Because, as you say, the assurance of that 80% of the drivers of success and the ability to bring your accountability to the people rather than to the incapacitated synthetic person that they are responsible for, would definitely be a big step forwards. Now, that brings us to the end of the questions that we had prepared for the panel. However, they're all brave people. So we're going to go through now and have a look and share our thoughts on some of the questions that have come up in the Q&A and in the chat. And I might start with more of a question, more of a comment than a question from Bill Nelson, which is that purpose, survival, and thriving can all be undone if the practice of funding the business is relying on delaying payments to suppliers. And we all saw, I think, going through COVID, how some organizations tightly managed their supply chains and their payments and disbursements in order to retain as much value for as long as possible. But the results of some of those behaviors have been quite devastating to people up and down the chain. What thoughts do you have on how you prevent that type of behavior? And I'll just throw this open to anyone in the panel to respond.
I'm happy to have a go at this one, because yeah, I think absolutely. And it comes back to Erika when talking about culture, you know, how a board and an organization deals with and treats its supply chain and suppliers is a fundamental constituent of the culture of the business. And I think it's absolutely true that you know, as a board, you have to be aware of these payment practices, and you need to be getting reporting on that, and you need to know how much of a squeeze is being put on those suppliers. And actually in the UK, we have legislation that requires all the largest companies to be very transparent and public about those payment practices and to report regularly on their achievement of agreed terms of payment. So I think transparency can help to really drive better practices. But hopefully, if you're setting the tone at the top from the board and having a responsible business agenda, and then looking after your suppliers, as recognizing the core fundamental part of your business model relies on an effective and robust supply chain, then I do think hopefully most boards are taking and exercising good oversight of that key part of the business model.
Because it is fundamentally important. I know many of the government organizations in Australia have regulatory requirements to report on their payment times across different sizes of supplier company, which is quite interesting. It hasn't quite flowed through into the whole of the commercial sector. But let's change topic now and jump quickly to a really excellent question from Carly Mofoa, and I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, Carly. But Carly's question is, when all is said and done to improve governance, that's great, but is enough being done to invest in the conscious development of the next generation of leaders in order to be able to achieve sustainable futures? A very deep question. Who wants to have a go at that?
The answer is yes, Julie, certainly. I applied my mind to this some years ago, that SDG 4, which is quality education, SDG 17, which is collaboration. And in my travels around the world, what I have learned is that different business schools and different universities teach accountancy, for example, differently, or business science issue differently. And they're teaching it in a way which is still silo thinking and very predicated towards the shareholder, for example. And in university in Australia, Deakin University in Melbourne, Australia, we actually established a separate building on integrated thinking and integrated reporting. And it's absolutely critical that everybody thinks on this integrated basis which Axel was thinking about. So the question being asked is that, yes, I started a Good Governance Academy 3 years ago, in which I got my network, which includes AICD in Australia, and, the Institute of Chartered Accountants of England and Wales, American Institute of Certified Public Accountants, IOD India, IOD UK, etc., so all to become members. And then we, and Carolyn Chalmers is the chief executive of it, we hold a colloquia with the best speakers in the world on these subjects. We summarize it and we send it to our support members, who send it to their members. So at our last colloquia on talking about integrated thinking and value creation, we sent that summary to, and it was received by 5 million accountants and directors in 135 countries. And in November, which not far away, our next colloquium is on inputs, impacts, and integration. And again, we have world-class speakers and things like Paul Druckmann, for example, Alan Johnson, the president of IFAC, speaking. And that summary will go to 5 million accountants, directors in 135 countries. And you start getting that combined thinking. And just on, while everybody is debating what is the standard of sustainability reporting, the question is how to do it, because the majority of companies, especially the mid-tier and lower cap companies, won't be able to consult one of the big four, the big six, from a cost point of view, don't have the in-house skills to do it. So we, the GGA, have started the ESG Exchange, where we've got global experts who are putting together a playbook on how to get these companies to do it all in the same manner. So we have true comparability on sustainability reporting. Otherwise, we're going to have differences and not have that comparability, which you can now have in financial reporting. So the same rigor and resilience that you've got in financial reporting, we have to achieve in sustainability reporting.
Very important to get that rigor and that training and that development. So yes, totally endorse those sentiments there. Another question from Hatta Hasham. One of the major problems is the governing body's core competencies, and Hatta's supposition is this is because incompetent individuals have been chosen to hold positions because of their political influence or their connections. And the governance as a whole therefore becomes paralyzed by these incompetent directors. What's the panelists' views on this? And more important, how do we put it back right?
I'm happy to sort of wade in on that one, because I think what we've seen in this region is board directors understanding that what was an honorary role to be asked to be on the board now comes with legal liabilities. And the regulators here do put people in jail, even if it's only to say, watch this space, and some big fines. And of course, it's very often name and shame in this part of the world as well. So we've actually seen board directors stepping down because they didn't want those sort of responsibilities any longer. But I think beyond that, I think there's a bigger recognition that the board has a strategic role, and it should be a strategic asset. And there are limited seats around the table. And if you want to create real value, you need to have people who are going to add value. And isn't it better to have somebody who's got the real skills and knowledge and competencies or expertise that you need for the future, not yesterday, sitting around your boardroom table? Isn't that better for the organization than having your friend who, you know, might be a nice guy or girl, usually a guy, but never mind, and actually, you know, not really adding huge value. So I think that it's still in its infancy in this part of the world as we recognize the true value of independent directors and diversity on boards. But I think the knowledge is there. It's just making that move to the next step.
I think.
Can I just add to what Jane has said? Jane and I have worked together many years, but we talk of diversity and we think of male and female, but intergenerational diversity on boards is absolutely critical, because Generation Z and millennials think differently sometimes on issues than what I do. And you need that intergenerational diversity, absolutely critical going forward.
And I think, just to add, Mervyn, as well, I think, you know, the skills that we need on the board for today or tomorrow are very different to the ones that we needed yesterday. So we're seeing more people with tech skills. Well, you know, it's not my generation, it's the generation behind, right, that bring the tech skills. And it's clearly people with sustainability understanding, knowledge that we need on boards today. And I think also it is strategic thinking, you know, and of course that integrated strategic thinking that we talk about. So the skills that we need are different.
I think you are absolutely right. And perhaps the most important skill of all is the skill to recognize when you don't have enough skill and you need to bring in somebody else to help you think through the issues. Let's move on to the next question. There are so many questions, and thank you so much to everyone who's typing questions. We're not going to get through them all, but as we did last year, we will look at them and we will type answers and we will put those answers on LinkedIn for you, so that, and on YouTube, so that you can at least see that your question has been received and acknowledged and some ideas given. A wonderful question from Gitika Bhatnagar, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, the representation of women, and that mention that Jane made of the lumpy or slightly empty pipeline. What are some best practices that individual corporations can put into place in order to ensure that their organizations allow a much more unimpeded flow of women through that pipeline? Who wants to have a go at that one for us?
Erika, go ahead.
Yeah, so I think I would take a little step back and say you need the best person for the job, not just somebody that ticks a gender box. But you need to make sure that your processes are not gender skewed, which a lot of them really can be them the questions they ask, the format that's expected, or even the expectation of what you would expect somebody to say back to you. So everybody comes into these sort of processes with an expectation of, that's how I would have answered that question. But actually we need to step back and say, actually, that's not, we don't want another me, we want somebody different. And I think being able to build a pipeline of women that feel that there is no glass ceiling to their ambitions is the start. And that comes down to the values and the culture of the organization, which arguably is built off of governance. And I think when you have that, you will end up with a pipeline of people coming through. And I think it's also the communication that you have externally as to whether your organization is one that other people, women and people of all different diversity traits feel they would want to work for that organization because they feel they would be heard. I think that's the most important thing.
And another great question from Bill Nelson. Is it possible for an organization to have a meaningful and value-based purpose if the culture is not focused on responses to external influences required by stakeholders? Who wants to answer that one?
Yes, I can answer that. Sorry, the answer is no.
Yes. Oh, good, short. So what should we do?
No, because
about
the value is always generated in It's for others. Like, what value are you generating for whom? And so therefore, those for whom you generate value, you must be in relationship with them. So it is, and the values of the organization are inextricably linked with the purpose of the organization. And in fact, even underneath that, the worldviews that the organization holds, which are, if somebody is interested in that, I think PAS 808, so the publicly available specification on purpose-led organizations, purpose-driven organizations, from the BSI, I think gives you a lot of information in that regard.
Excellent. And now a complete jump in topic from Damien Lamas, a question about education. Damien comments that the seeds of siloed or blinkered thinking, as opposed to open-minded and critical thinking, which is what we want on boards, start within the state school systems at a very early age, and that turning this around is going to be like turning around a cruise liner. Some comments from the panelists. How do we engage the education ministries rather than only the economic and financial political parties and organizations? How do we impact as corporations that education system?
Yes, I would agree that it requires all of society and a collaboration across society, and that is why it is important to have good governance in ministries, in schools, and everywhere, since that is impacting it. And I think often I feel that the young persons, the students, the kids, they are coming up naturally and good. We need to focus on the ones who are creating the damage and try to correct that. So there are fewer points that we need to touch to have a big shift going on and to renew.
And it brings us back to that whole holistic integrated thinking model that we've heard come so strongly through. Erika, you had a comment.
Yes, I was just going to say, I was state school educated and I work quite a lot with state schools, and actually and underperforming ones at that. And I actually think that there's quite a lot of schools, particularly in the UK, that are very focused on making sure that these type of blinkered thinking doesn't happen. They get speakers in. I'm a speaker, a voluntary speaker for schools, and come in and talk about my experiences. And that's something that lots of schools want. And I think that as much as, yes, we can start at the top, but sometimes it's also starting in the middle and at the bottom, because the top seems very far away, whereas those people that are in those schools that care about those kids and care about what they're building for the future, and those teachers that take their jobs very seriously, as they should, they are the ones that are making the impact, and those are the ones that are making the change. So I think it's, in my view, it's not as bad as perhaps it looks like from the outside. There are people coming through the system that will be of a different mindset despite their educational background.
And I think I'm going to have to draw it to a close there, but what a wonderful sentiment to end with, that idea that it doesn't matter where you start, just as long as you do start. What an important message for education, for governance, and indeed for living our best lives and fulfilling our greatest potentials. So from me, thank you. You have been a dream panel. Wonderful contributions, generous sharing of learning. I'll hand over now to Carolyn for some closing remarks, and I'll finish with a big plug for that next colloquium. I stay up all night for these. They are well worth the effort we put into them. Carolyn, over to you.
Thank you so much for facilitating again a fantastic event. Hope to have it again next year. So you heard a little bit about what we'll be discussing at next year's event, and want to see from Axel what happened with all of those national adoptions, because it just came to me that, the how ISO 37000 is being rolled out around the world is pretty similar to how I guess that the ISSB standards, the International Sustainability Standards Board standards, need to be rolled out with national considerations and national dialogue, and then national adoption. So very interesting in terms of the rollout. And Jane, thank you so much for the Gulf information. I think we've got a Governance Around the World series, and we haven't heard from the Gulf. So interestingly, in terms of the priorities of those companies in that region, specifically since, you know, the whole move to net zero has to impact. And I didn't know that Dubai is going to be the next COP27, COP28.
It'll be COP28 in Dubai. Yeah.
Fantastic. And Tracy, thank you so much. Can't wait to look forward to read that report. Please let me know when the report is available. I will put the link on the event page so people can have a look at your understanding, the research that's been done on the governance side of things, so we can learn from what you're saying and improving our reporting in our annual report on governance. And then Axel, again, we're looking forward to those standards. There were some questions about where are we with the standards. These take time. It's going to, I think, probably towards the end of next year or even 2024. But we can talk about that at next year's event. And then Erika, finally, thank you so much for giving us the practical perspectives. You know, the actual your background is in being a company secretary of a listed entity. In fact, you've got the scar tissue. You can give us some practical insights. So I really do appreciate giving us that guidance. So thank you very much, everyone. And I'm sorry that David and Bob couldn't make this session, but we will make sure that we have them attending our next session. And again, the plug for the 8th colloquium on the 3rd of November. There we've got Sue Lloyd from the ISSB. We've got Saskia Slomp, CEO of EFRAG, Paul Druckerman, Michael Bray. We've got all the global speakers there giving us guidance in terms of corporate reporting, the inputs, outputs, outcomes, integration around corporate reporting. And finally, thank you so much to Professor Mervyn King for founding the Good Governance Academy and giving us the mandate to hold events such as these. Thank you so much. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye, everyone.